What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police, EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. The Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps and one of the first people to come across this village after it happened. He said it was so eerie because all the flies and mosquitoes had died and it was so silent. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch, ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add. I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story, it's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. What really upsets me most about this is that Singleton was released from jail for good behavior, and went on to murder a different woman a few years later, Roxanne Hayes. I think in these scenarios we can safely say that if you can rape someone, chop their fucking arms off and leave them to die, you aren't ever safe to be released. Well, he hasn't chopped any arms off or raped anyone in the last 2 years while in jail, so he is pretty much good to be released early. What the fuck were they actually thinking? The part of this story that fucked me up was she tried to run. He grabbed her by the arm and turned and hacked her with the hatchet. She said she watched as her dismembered arm clung to his forearm after he separated it. It wasn't just a ditch. It was a steep embankment where the highway had been built up, approximately 30 feet deep. She climbed up 30 steep, rocky feet after having her forearms chopped off and being brutally raped and survived. Bad ass. SSDGM. John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, canceling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. He pretty much explained that he killed his family to ensure their entry into heaven because he was worried they were straying from their faith. So in a way, he thought he was saving their souls. Killers like that are the scariest. He thought he had a noble reason, but in reality he was crazy. One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work. Arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in. Which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught, his mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. Edit. The guy's name was Terry Driver. Here's a link to his wiki. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Link for those interested. 3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later, due to the lack of air. The Navy knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. 16 days to die. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits, miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming in to 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door and pushed a bunch of boxes against it and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me.
Then about a year after that incident my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 minus $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Edit. Whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments, questions. Sorry if I end up missing yours. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something, so anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. Tough to pick just one because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful. But in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him, upside down, against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. This is not a joke, the teen said over 911. I'm almost dead. He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I love her if I die. Link just a horrible, random accident that could have happened to anybody. This kid didn't go looking for trouble. Like he didn't try and go down a chimney or go caving like other people who have gotten stuck and suffocated. He was just reaching for something in his trunk, got pinned, and then was not found in time. Nightmarish for the kid and his family. I still don't get why the hell they couldn't have gotten to him in time. His parents have filed a lawsuit over this, because honestly there's no reason that child should have died as long as he was on that phone with 911. I don't get it either, and I'm glad they filed a lawsuit. The fact that the 911 dispatcher didn't relay info about the vehicle to the police that were on scene is what killed that boy. They were there, searching, and he gave them a description of the vehicle as he was dying. For whatever reason, she claimed her computer was frozen, but then WTF did she take the call? The dispatcher opted not to tell the police because I guess the kid wasn't actually answering questions? Which makes sense because it was an emergency situation where the kid couldn't hear his phone. While looking for articles I saw one saying that the dispatcher had been put on leave but was allowed to return to work. Absolutely disgraceful. God help anyone else who calls and ends up getting her because apparently she gets to choose what she does or does not relay to the police. I remember this story and it made me so unbelievably angry at the dispatcher. This death was completely avoidable if the dispatcher had done her job. It's so damned senseless. He had time to call the police twice. He absolutely could have been saved. It took his father driving out there when they hadn't heard from him to find him, and by then it was way too late. I get that EMS dispatchers have a stressful job, but I just cannot get it into my brain why she didn't relay the car information to the police. Why? It would have taken 3 extra seconds. And clearly she could hear him because they could hear him enough to transcribe the call after the fact. I can't imagine being the parents and knowing what happened. Their kid was killed because this dispatcher didn't take the 3 extra seconds to tell the cops who were already on scene what the car looked like. And can you imagine being the poor kid? Stuck. Trying your hardest until you just give up and accept the inevitable, and ask the dispatcher that's ignoring you to please tell your mother that you love her. It's infuriating. She killed that boy. I don't regret many things in my life. But I regret this one deeply. I was leaving work, 2001 I believe. So while cell phones were common, not everyone had them. I worked in a small office building, you know those kind that rent out spaces to several small businesses. I had stayed late on day, only reason I feel as bad as I do. As I was leaving, I was the only other car in the lot. I noticed the property manager, an elderly lady and very sweet, getting out of her car next to the dumpster holding a bag of trash. I drove past her, turned the corner, and went home. This was on a Friday night. Come to find out, she didn't put her car in park. I get in Monday to the news that she was pinned between the dumpster and her car until found on Sunday. Our dumpster was not visible from any main road. Had I been 30 seconds later in leaving, I would have seen it happen. Being elderly, the low impact still pinned her and broke some bones. Even though she was found alive, she didn't make it at the hospital. I don't know if I had seen it happen I would have been able to react fast. Enough to warn her, jump out and push the car. It wasn't accelerating, just rolling slowly in neutral. Or if I had would have even just been able to call 911 and her injuries treatable after not being outside for 2 days. And I can't imagine her mindset. We were in a commercial area, no real reason for anyone to be immediately within earshot if she called for help. Which I'm sure she did, many times. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. Link. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, NY. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light, and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow, and smashed head-on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My God, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news, that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten motherfucker driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Low HUD and Channel 12 News. Years ago my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical-type businesses e.g. care homes etc. and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy-duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling etc. needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying, pressing when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called and the laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cot waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized. Just on shift was the best guess. So just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper trolley thing. The other nurses, parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in to stop anything like that happening again. Edit. Just found it in the newspaper. Turns out I misremembered the how of getting into the laundry basket. Slightly wrong link. On September 20, 1987 in Bellingham, Washington, a Georgia Pacific paper mill worker was sent to inspect a heat exchanger system in the steam plant. Inside the base of the stack, he spotted a charred skeleton. To this day, no one is certain who the victim was, how they wound up in such a horrible place, nor why. Local paper. Link. Good YouTube video on the subject. Link. You know shit is real serious if the sentence starts with the complete date. The Toy Box Killer and his transcripts. If you absolutely want to have your day ruined, this has to be one of the most disturbing, creepiest things ever. Serial killer David Parker Ray would play these tapes for his victims, so they had an idea of what was coming and to also mentally break them. Hear the start of one tape to give you an idea. Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained. Gagged. Probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared, too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal, under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you, in detail, why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture, because this tape is being created July 23, 1993 as a general advisory tape for future female captives. Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to wake up in a place you didn't know and have someone play these tapes for you telling you what horrible things were going to happen to you before you died? I remember this poor kid who went missing while I was at Purdue. Linky was trying to come home to his dorm after a party and either wasn't able to get into the building or perhaps wanted to bypass the check-in desk. Just a guess based on my experience as a student there, since he had been drinking. He entered the building through a door to an electrical closet that should have been locked and was electrocuted and killed that night. He was last seen January 13 and the body was discovered March 19 after reports of foul odors at the dorm. Edit. The body was found at Owen Hall, year 2007. I remember talking with friends about theories of what happened when he went missing. How terrifying it must have been to find out there was a dead body in your dorm for months. Update. Thanks for the silver. And thanks everyone for contributing the memories and other details, lingering questions. Sorry if any current Purdue folks are feeling weirded out. Be safe and stay out of the maintenance closets. Link. Guy goes into a small building and dies. Later, investigator shows up and sees the body, calls 911 and then dies. Paramedics show up to help them, then die. The reason? Oxygen levels at head height were normal. Oxygen levels when bent over was basically zero. Bending over in this room killed 4 people by asphyxiation. Edit. They could breathe. The air they were breathing contained no oxygen. The human body can't tell the difference. My wife arrived at her parents' house that she was currently living in due to health issues of her father's. She got into the house, no one else was there at the time, and instead of going further in, stopped in the first room that held the computers which was right by the door. She went into the room and was messing around on the internet when one of the cats came into the room. Her cat to be precise. Well, this cat was super laid back. Loved everyone and never picked fights or got aggressive. He would literally lay down and let squirrels throw pecans at him from trees and do nothing but take it. Not tonight, however. Tonight he was growling and hissing intermittently while standing between my wife and the entrance to the rest of the house. A laid-back sweet old cat was acting like he was going to rip out a throat. Well, my wife decided that this was really fucking weird, so she picked up her cat and left the house. Lo and behold, she sees a cop car patrolling down her street and flagged them down. She explained the situation and they demanded, that she stay in their cruiser while they both checked it out. Turns out they found the back door wide open, super bad. Her parents and her never leave the door unlocked, much less open. She came to find out later from those cops that they were hunting down a serial rapist that had been spotted in the area, and that was why they were rolling down a safe, normally residential street. Super spooky. Life pro tip? Always trust the cat. I used to have an incredibly chill, skittish little Siamese cat. Not a fighter. Not a ruffian. She would hide under the bed when anyone but me was in the house. Landlords and repair workers would say, "I thought you said you had a cat." But she was extremely loyal to me and bonded to me. I was living in an attic apartment where the front door opened onto stairs, and then the stairs went straight up into the living room. One night she is standing at the foot of the stairs inside the house, yowling her fool head off. Just howling and yowling and really going to town. I'm half asleep and listening to her and wondering WTF, wishing she would stop. Then I hear it. A hand grabs the doorknob and turns it. Click. Turns it again. Click. Turns it again. Click. Someone is quietly but forcefully trying to jimmy open the door by twisting the doorknob hard in the middle of the night. Boom, I'm awake. My feet are on the floor. I'm like immediately vertical. And my cat races to the top of the stairs, looks me in the eyes and falls silent. She had done her job and gotten my ass up. This is about 2 o'clock am. My boyfriend at the time would sometimes come home super late from his overnight job. So the first thing I do is call him and whisper, asking him if he's trying to get in the front door. He says what? Fuck no, call the cops now. Turn on all the lights in the house, make noise, get off the phone with me, and call the cops. Then call me right back. I do that, and the doorknob stops. The cops come and search the area and the block and find no one. It never happened again. After that I also barricaded the door. I'll never forget that what could have been an extremely dangerous if not potentially brutal situation in the middle of the night was foiled by my gentle little scaredy cat Pussycat with big saucer eyes who was terrified of her shadow. But when shit got real, she woke my ass up. I couldn't have asked more of a dog. Cats are badass. Never doubt it. My girl has gone on across the rainbow bridge, as they say. But I'll always treasure her loyalty and intelligence in this. Holy crap, I have a similar story. Relative of mine was in college and living in a small off-campus house by herself. At the time she thought she might have had a stalker. She had gotten some strange phone calls. No one answering on the other end, heavy breathing and that sort of thing, among other things. One night she is home alone in her bedroom studying. Just her and a cat that she had recently adopted. So recent in fact that she hadn't even named the cat yet. The whole time she is studying, the cat is acting crazy. Pacing the floor meowing constantly, and sitting right in front of her closet meowing non-stop. She is getting really annoyed and finally has enough, so she gets up and goes to the closet to open it for the cat and hopefully shut him up. When she opens it there is a man sitting in her closet, and when she opened it, it startled him, so he jumps up, pushes her out of the way and bolts out of the house, literally ripping a hole in the screen door as he tore through it. She calls the cops, of course, gives a description. She had a clear look at his face. They find and arrest him. Turns out, he was also a serial rapist. He had been stalking her for weeks and broke into her house to wait in her closet until she was asleep, at which time he would pull his mask down and rape her. Same pattern with his other victims, but she was the only one to see his face. Her testimony put him in prison. The cat saved her. Always trust the cat. Happened to me, have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet, she was 5 feet 3, and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Hold the fuck up for a moment. What the fuck? Yup. Still impacts me 30 years later. How in the fuck are you okay? Been a long time since it happened, but I am not 100% okay. I am still really paranoid about in-home security. People mock me sometimes about it, but not a lot I can do about the fear. It is around to stay. Have you heard of the Nazis so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oskar der Lewanger, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the der Lewanger Brigade. Oskar der Lewanger was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oskar's old pal Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers, and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails camps, and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases civilians in occupied countries. Oskar der Lewanger SS unit was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay. Once the church was secured they raped the female staff, and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them, and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully by the end of the war this unit was destroyed and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals. A high-priority inmate who could implicate dozens of wealthy and powerful people apparently committed suicide while on suicide watch at his prison. And the footage can't be found due to a malfunction of the camera. But, the news told me that's how it happened and the news is never wrong. Told this here before but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise so he'd go outside to look around but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property but would find nothing. It was persistent so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e. without lights, sirens. And when they approached the van, the door swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. Japanese war crimes in WW2. That is my real answer, but it does remind me of that movie with Paul Rudd where they're talking about scary stories around the campfire and he says something like, "Everyday children like you are kidnapped and sold into child sex trafficking rings." Role models: the Paul Rudd movie, not the WW2 Japanese. This may just horrify me more than others. Link Dude was working on a tuna steamer and they closed him in and steamed him. I can't help but imagine that as anything but a truly terrifying and painful way to die. One of the main reasons I never could bring myself to do real factory labor is because I don't trust people enough to not tuna steam me. Edit. Thanks for the gold. Rip Jose Milena. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between two trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. Dude is lucky he didn't get decapitated. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18 and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night, early morning, raped and left blacked out in the alley. It was just a fucked up and surreal situation to be involved in. During World War II, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Chichijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. One was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The one serviceman who was rescued? That was George H. W. Bush. Google Chichijima incident for more details if you'd like. A headless, limbless torso was found in the bushes at the rest stop in the town where I grew up. They never found the rest of her body parts or the murderer. She wasn't even identified until about a decade later. She was a prostitute that had been estranged from her family. My mom's theory is that a truck driver from out of state did it. Dismembered her, dumped her torso at the rest stop, and scattered the rest of her over state lines. Could have been an isolated incident or it could be a serial killer. We might not ever know. Edit. Here's a news article on it if any of you are interested. Wright City torso. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bedbugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I am like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on Watt Avenue, Sacramento. On May 31, 2014, 2 12-year-old girls lured their friend into the woods and brutally stabbed her in an attempt to summon or appease Slenderman, a fictional internet villain who is said to inhabit wooded areas and stalk his victims among the trees. I've posted this before, but mine. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses. With a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea. Though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out, well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to Banks, a grocery store where one dad was manager, and clear out accounts, a safe. They then came back to the house, and slaughtered both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend. Kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials, and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too. Edit. Wow, you guys are amazing detectives. I have been telling this story for years, and this is the first time I have been made aware that it wasn't me as a baby. It was my sister, 9 years older, born in '72. My dad has been telling me this story wrong for as long as I can remember. Sorry for the confusion, all.